Hey everyone, I'm Max, him. I live in Glendale, Queens, out by Ridgewood. I'm here because I was at the first session and it was amazing. Can't wait to hear more. And also for the BFC comrade this Saturday in this office at 3 p.m. There's a meeting about the New Deal for CUNY and we're having all our BFC members come. And then Monday night, there's a Strike Power Town Hall that's going to have speakers from the ES Teamsters, SAG-AFTRA strikers, WGA strikers, and others talk about how strikes build working class power. So everyone should come to that.
I'm Doug McGee, and I am a journalist writing in politics for many years. And I'm a member of the Political Education Planning Committee, and I'm here because we're all about liberty.
My name is Micah, he, him. I live in Flatbush, and I was in the first session. I was fantastic, and excited to keep talking about labor.
Hey everyone, I'm Aaron. I live in Kensington, but that's Hudson, New York, and I'm here because I'm originally from Detroit and I love the art.
I'm Eva, I live in Brooklyn, Central Brooklyn, and I'm here because I have multiple people in first session with Maven. I just want to myself.
Matt, in Brooklyn.
I'm actually, I live in Brooklyn and I live in the first section and I do like it, so.
I'm Steve. I'm on the citywide quality edit. I live in Greenpoint, so I'm from Ozone Park originally, Queens, and I'm very excited to hear Steve talk.
Jeremy, he, him. I'm the co-chair of NYCBSA. I'm just looking for an excuse to read this book, and also, you know, it's a very exciting time for the labor movement. So I think thinking about the history of the labor question is quite important. Thank you, Steve.
Hi, I'm Carrington Sheeher. I am from City by Ed, and I know less than I would like to know about the labor movement. So I'm really excited to learn more. Steve, last session was amazing. Please.
I'm Isabel Sheeher, I live in Brooklyn and I've been wanting to talk to DSA events for a long time. I feel like now is an incredible time to learn about labor history. My name is Anna. I live in Portsmouth. I'm looking for a way back here from the way that I'm going to DSA. I don't know as much as I should know about labor history.
My name is Peter Ethan. I live in Washington Heights, and I'm here because I love to learn about history about the labor movement. You know a lot of my reading and your voice. So it's really cool to be here and meet in person. But yeah, and I want to do this like people. There's Ben, I beat him, and I'm also on the college committee. Really excited about this event, and you know, if any of you are getting involved, want to get involved with Polyed, you know, talk to me about the other committee members afterwards.
Paul, I live in Parksville also, and Brooklyn branch. Him, and my dad was one of the first members of 1199, and my grandfather was in the Bund. And I went to social summer camp, and you learn labor history as a kid. But it's always more to learn. And Jeremy told me that for a second was great, and that Steve is really brilliant.
Hey, I'm Jesse, he, him, North Brooklyn. I'm on the Political Education Committee. And I'm super excited to learn more about labor history, which I don't know a lot. The readings took me forever to go through because I had to Google things constantly, both events and a handful of words, and loved it.
Okay, then we got a couple of stragglers that came in.
You want to introduce yourself, Ashley?
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm on the Polyed Committee for North Brooklyn. I guess Watch Citywide now, and I'm really interested to learn more about labor. Really excited.
I'm Evan. The pronouns. I'm in the Central Brooklyn branch. Also, yeah, I want to learn more about the kind of like called labor movement. Every time I read about the labor movement in 19th century, it's like really crazy. So yeah, excited to learn more about it.
Easy. Thank you all for being here. Unless we're already running late, so I just take it away.
Thank you. It's a little, catch as catch can. We have a sound and light show. I don't know how that's going to work, but they'll do a great job putting it together. That show is connected to the sheets of paper with these quotes, which hopefully are provoking, thought-provoking. I don't know if they were given to you. I know they were given to you here. I don't know if you received them before we convened here. Maybe not. Look at them if you can, and they're going to be up on that screen in random order because Doug and I didn't choreograph it. We volunteered, maybe next time. Look, what I'm going to, this is supposed to be a seminar, which means it should mainly be discussion, and you can interrupt me at any time. But the discussion segment, which should be the lion's share of what we do, depends on everybody having read stuff. Otherwise, the burden is on me, and I'm a little guy, I can't bear that burden. So hopefully you've read stuff. If not, and you come back, you will have read stuff. Some of you already know a lot of stuff. So, but what I'm going to begin with is talking to you about what you didn't read, or what you were supposed to have read. What am I trying to say? I'm going to talk to you about what was not in the reading, so that it won't be redundant for those of you who did read. So I want to talk, and I'm going to assume there's a kind of, what was the Gilded Age? This is the framework for the labor question discussion tonight, is how that question emerged during what is been usually called for more than 100 years, the Gilded Age. What was it? It's a kind of moral and political category. It has no other rigorous historical meaning, nor does it even have clear chronological boundaries. Some people date it beginning after the Civil War, running all the way through to the Great Depression. Others define it much more compactly, beginning sometime in the late 19th century, running through the World War I, blah, blah. Who cares? The point is, Mark Twain wrote a book called The Gilded Age. It was published in 1873. It became a bestseller. It became a Broadway play. It toured the country, and it took the country by storm. And to this day, it's a funny book, except for the parts his co-author wrote, which are very dull and pedantic. But it's a guy named Charles Dudley Warner. But that's where we get the name from. And it's a kind of misnomer, because gilded is supposed to suggest unnecessarily beautifying something that's already beautiful. But the age that book was about was not beautiful. It was pretty ugly, but the Gilded Age nonetheless is, what Twain focused on was the rank political corruption that characterized that period of time. This is a real period of industrial capitalist takeoff in the country, and it is a time when the state, the government, functions as the handmaid of industrialists, especially railway builders, steel magnates, people, mine companies, bridge builders, and the corruption is rife. Vice presidents, secretaries of the Treasury are implicated in all kinds of.
Go ahead. Oh, that's not gonna work. Go ahead, sorry.
It is an age of corruption and con men. Capitalism depends on confidence. It involves long-range impersonal relationships with people you don't know and need to trust. Of course, there's an armature of legal structures that enforce that kind of trust. Nonetheless, in the end, it resides on trust, and people can take advantage of that confidence, play on that confidence, and make money. And we know that people do that all the time today. Scamming is part of, inherent in a capitalist economy. It was rife during the Gilded Age. There are notorious examples you can read about. the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which linked the two coasts, is a notorious example of that. There are many others. So Twain was talking about that, and in that way, it's a bit reminiscent of the moment we've been living through for a long time in this country. It means something else. It means, and which Twain did not focus on, inequality. Now, we take inequality for granted in our day and age, but not back then. America was born as a hierarchical society, but a much more compressed and flattened hierarchy than was true in Europe. And moreover, right, for those of you who were here last week, that John Smith vision of every man a master, which had a certain traction in this country, in this society, because of the billions of acres that could be stolen or finagled out of indigenous populations, actually made it possible for people to have their own property, be self-reliant, have their own, what in those days was called competency. And so the first half of the 19th, there are plenty of aristocrats, there's a hierarchy, but I would call it a kind of petty bourgeois republic in the first half of the 19th century after the Civil War, and therefore a relative rough kind of equality, economic equality. I mean, racial here, obviously, but a rough economic equality. So what happens in the Gilded Age when you begin to get serious capital investment, the emergence of wage labor, striking maldistributions of wealth and income. And this is very striking to everybody. And some of the quotes, I see, yeah, good. And reading that, yeah, there you go. There's that, yeah, okay, that's cool. That's Mrs. Astor, the Mrs. Astor, the doyen of high society with the social register during the Gilded Age. Someone once called her, she would wear so much jewelry that they called her a walking chandelier. She is, and of course, you also have Herman Melville's quote on your paper, conveying what he's coming up. Is it coming up? Oh, you and I just were instinctively on the same thing. Okay. So there's this inequality that, to compare to 19th century America, is very striking and worrying, alarming to people. It was shocking. It isn't to us today. It's not shocking. We don't like it. It's ugly, but it's not new. And it was then quite new. It also, I don't know who's asked those. Then what we have as well is people like Astor who engaged in what became known and is known to this day as conspicuous consumption. This is the period during which Veblen writes his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, and they parade their wealth. And we may look back on that and see it as somewhat comical. They cooked up these fake genealogies. They had liveried servants. They married off their daughters to bankrupt European nobility. They wanted pedigrees. If they had to invent them, they did. And they did need to invent them because most of these men, and they were all men, are men from nowhere. There is no really established social hierarchy of the sort Europe is accustomed to. So they are confecting this social pedigree, and for two reasons, I think. Not all. Morgan, for instance, comes from a long line of bankers, and he's born to wealth. But Vanderbilt is not. He's a ferry boat captain on Staten Island. Jay Gould is not. He's a con man. He used to be a con man at circuses. This is actually the case. Many of these guys are like that, and so there's nothing under them to warrant the kind of authority that their wealth suggests they should command in society. And there's two problems. How do you, so conspicuous consumption is a form of power. It's a way of displaying power, of legitimacy, of the right to rule. And increasingly they are a ruling elite without any of the credentials that in Europe might have gone along with that. And then the other thing is they're fearful. they're very fearful because they're living in a society that's kind of like boiling over with anger about inequality, corruption, other matters, and they know their right to rule rests on a very fragile foundation. There's a kind of fear that haunts this whole society all through the Gilded Age, and some of what you've read, I hope you've read, suggests that. So then there's another feature which is important for us to understand the Gilded Age, and that is its ideological commitment to social Darwinism and laissez-faire, which is another defense of this nouveau riche, what used to be called chip-chop aristocracy, fake. It's another defense of that aristocracy that they are the fittest. And social Darwinism, as I'm sure most of you know, is a kind of extrapolation of Darwinian evolutionary theory that applies it to social life and decides not only that the fittest will survive and rise to the top of our social order, but it's good that they do so because that is what ensures progress. And at the top are people like William Graham Sumner, a very famous Yale professor, who was a disciple of Herbert Spencer in Britain, who was the chief advocate of social Darwinism, writes a book and he says, the name of the book is What Do Social Classes Owe to Each Other? And his answer is nothing. And he means that because to take on these old paternal obligations would actually block the kind of progress that Darwinian survival of the fittest, right. And this too justifies a laissez-faire attitude. The Gilded Age is noted for its laissez-faire attitude. That's a tricky laissez-faire, that the government should stay out of the affairs of civil society, particularly out of the affairs of the business world. Let it do what it does naturally, competitively, and the results will be beneficial to society as a whole. The contradiction of that is that actually capitalist development all during the Gilded Age depends on the state. And kind of like today, if you think about it for a moment, when right-wing laissez-faire ideologues talk all the time about they're very anti-government, but they heavily rely on subsidies, tax exemptions, land grants, et cetera, in order to survive and thrive. So did they too back during the Gilded Age. And so state development is part of the other great thing about the Gilded Age to know, and then it was a period of obvious economic transformation, enormous wealth growth. No society ever has developed as rapidly, economically speaking, as the United States until maybe China in the last period of time. It's astounding. It does that in a variety of ways, but the state plays a crucial role in doing that. So that's one thing that's the framework, the Gilded Age, in which this labor question will arise. You could stop me now and ask questions, have discussion.
Mention about state development.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it started with Alexander Hamilton, with our manufacturers. Did that continue through the Gilded Age? Or?
Yeah, it does. In other words, Hamilton's vision he wanted America to become a kind of little England or even a big England, a commercial and industrial. His report on manufacturing was a way of the government sponsoring manufacturing development in this very underdeveloped country. Right. So it is a continuation, and actually 19th century politics is a struggle between those who favor state action to develop the economy. They want to build canals, have the government help build canals, other kinds of internal improvements in order to have the market spread throughout, market relations spread throughout American society. And there are others who they want a tariff. So as to encourage infant industry in America, and then there are others in the old Democratic Party of the Anglo who don't want to do that. So yeah, it's part of that. And now the Republican Party is triumphant after the Civil War. It is a party committed to economic development. It will pass a whole series of tariffs, for example, all through the 19th century, protecting infant American industry from European competitors. Yeah.
Like, so about social Darwinism.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I've read a decent amount, but I'm curious, like, so when we think about ideology in the present, we think about like, in part, what elites think, but also like we have things like the mass media that help diffuse elite ideas through the society. Was there anything like that for something like social Darwinism in the late 19th century, or was this just like an elite set of, like William Graham Sumner? Did he have like an audience outside of like people at Yale who were like, yeah, it's all, yes, we are rich, we love being rich?
He had an audience, big one, but not among ordinary people. Spoke to intellectual, middle class folks, professionals, others, a very big audience. He was a very popular figure. I think that what you do have, and this is part of the Gilded Age, is you have religious versions of that survival of the fittest ideology. There's the most famous, most frequently given, not famous, speech in American history, I think to this day, was given by a man named Reverend Conwell, called Acres of Diamonds. And Acres of Diamonds, he became the founder of Temple University in Philadelphia. Acres of Diamonds is basically a defense of the idea that everybody, by striving, competing against their fellows, can actually, in the end, in America, realize acres of diamonds, can rise. And that is this notion that America is an elastic, mobile place, that it has no classes, that classes, if they have them, are constantly going out of existence, liquefying, because there's so much opportunity, there's so much land, there are so many other opportunities for venturing into various business stores, the craft workshop, that it's a land that provides the wherewithal for people to compete, survive, and thrive. And Acres of Diamonds is a kind of expression, a religious expression of that. Yeah.
Well, I guess I had a question. I feel like I get the political corruption angle, and I actually just always like the fact that I think it's pretty intuitive, just in the sense that you still know the names of all these rich guys, like Morgans and so on, but you don't know the name of any of the presidents. They were not the important people steering the ship in this time period. I guess my question is, the text makes an allusion to the Boss Tweed and the kind of like patronage, the urban machines, and that aspect of, I guess, corruption. Like the violence is very striking, but I just wanted to know a little bit more about that. This kind of like the vote buying and so on.
And right, there are these urban machines which begin to develop in the Gilded Age, even before the Gilded Age. As you know, I mean, one of the questions we can wrestle with is what is the relationship between capitalism and democracy? Can they cohere? When do they bump heads? What do you do when they do bump heads? The urban machine, the Boss Tweed machine, and the machines begin to develop all over the country are one answer to that. They are cash machines. They have tight relations with the business. They let contracts for urban development, whether that's building a street railway or a sewer or whatever it is. They can make a lot of money. They get kickbacks from all kinds of local businesses, but they also service the hoi polloi. They service the members of that machine. They provide Christmas baskets. They get them jobs. They get them patronage jobs, working at some low level of the civil service. And they generate a kind of loyalty at that level for the machine. So they they become increasingly key intermediaries at the local level, not nationally. Later, there are machines, much later, that will play national roles. Nationally, the Senate becomes known as the Millionaires Club, as a place that represents corporations, not people. Of course, this is a period when senators are not directly elected; they're elected by their state legislators, who are themselves, entangled with all kinds of business interests. So, at the national level, like one of those things from Weaver, the populist presidential candidate, talks about how the whole political apparatus is encumbered by the money pile. He calls it the money pile. I hope you show that you're right, nobody remembers the president, but there's a wonderful quote from Benjamin Harrison. Who is, oh, good, cool, yeah. Well, that's not him, but,
One more, Jesse.
there we go, oh,
Yeah.
that's sort of is the gist of
I
that.
apologize, just show me the type larger.
Can you read it? Well, it's on your sheet, anyway. Yeah, anybody else on this? Yes, oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could you had mentioned that the inequality of the period was really shocking to
Yeah.
people. I was curious if you could just elaborate a little bit more about what exactly was shocking. Was it the wealth of the middle class, poverty, both, but I can imagine, that in the 1890s or early 1900s, there's a lot of charity and social, sort of oriented charities, or equality in the 60s or inequality today, people can still be shocked by the level of poverty or something. But just what was it that was shocking to people at the time?
Well, it's both the extraordinary wealth and the extraordinary poverty, both of those things, that it leaves much of American society, especially urban society, on a kind of razor's edge. These great, they used to, the social register family used to hold these great balls, masquerade balls. They would dress up as nobility, as European, they'd be, or Julius Caesar or Queen Victoria, really. And they were very ostentatious about it. And these were reported in all the newspapers. Well, these balls became the site for violent demonstrations, attempts to break into, I think not the wall, but later, I forget the hotel. So there are incendiary incidents. I mean, people are astonished that in the midst, look, the Gilded Age every 20 years has a serious depression. No, more frequently than that. 1873, exactly when Twain wrote this book, begins a depression that the country hadn't experienced ever before. It lasts for 4 years and is punctuated by the great 1877 railroad strike, when the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad cuts the wages of their workers. And there's this enormous explosion, which if you have read the stuff you've read about, what I have called in this book a mass strike, not a strike of the sort we're used to, but a mass strike, which involves the whole community from Baltimore to the West Coast, every place, farmers, shopkeepers, you read about it. So then in the mid 80s, there's another depression. 1893 is an even deeper depression. Often these are catapulted by the bankruptcy of the railroads. Railroads are a prime mechanism for high-level, completely unwarranted speculation by the leading speculators of the age. So that these are railroads, some bonds are issued and speculating for railroads that either don't exist, or tracks that run to nowhere, or for railroads that are so rickety they practically invite accidents. And then they go bankrupt because they're financed by what's called watered stock. We know that expression today. I'll tell you how that expression originated. One of the original, early speculators, a guy named Daniel Drew. All these guys are very folksy. He used to know as Uncle Dan. He was a con man. Uncle Dan used to be just a cattle drover. He would drive cattle into the city from the countryside. And before he got to the city, however, he put out salt licks for the cattle so they would drink like crazy and weigh a ton when he got to sell them. And that's called watered stock. And that's how we get that expression of watered stock, utterly fraudulent. So part of the accusation that's being leveled by people, and I'm going to get to the populists in a minute, is that this is a fictitious economy, a fraudulent economy, grossly overinflated, enriching a handful of connected speculators and politicians. And that enrages people about the inequality. And that's the way it's been generated and supported. There was some other stuff.
this touches a bit on what Ben was saying about it. You know, I'm impressed by how, despite like the last third of the 19th century, I think at the time, extremely strong uprisings and challenged where you are. The bourgeoisie maintained control of the state, with few exceptions, right? And, you know, succeeded in crushing the working class after many fights. How did they maintain that control of the state? You talked about the millionaires club of the Senate. Well, what was the relation between the capitalists and the political class?
Yeah, that's a good question because a lot of these people I've described to you have no interest in politics. They're businessmen pure all the way through. They have no social. They have no sense of noblesse oblige. They're not like the British or French aristocracy who have a political conscience. Or not a conscience, they have a sense of that they are entitled to rule and have the pedigree to justify that. A lot of these people don't have that. It's only with, and so they let the politicians, they buy the politicians, they buy the justices. You know, a lot of the judicial system is rankly corrupt. They purchase they take care of their needs, but they don't have their specific business needs, but they don't have a kind of overall, until you get populism and you begin to get a sense among some circles that they need to arm themselves politically, take control of these machines or the national political system in ways that they haven't really had to before, because there's a real political threat that's emerging. Yes, everybody's defeated, that's right. But I would argue, you know, we're like way, I'm screwed up here because this is really not about labor right now, but I wanted to talk to you about populism for a minute. Populism is probably the most serious political threat to the ruling order that's ever presented itself in America. And it was enormously successful, and as you know, it elected senators and governors and many congressmen, and its presidents won electoral votes. It had hundreds and hundreds of local officials. Its message was spread all around the country. It threatened maybe Tom Watson's quote can get up there. It threatened the kind of rare interracial alliance in the South among Black and white farmers. So it was enormously powerful, and its indictment of capitalism was very extreme. What I mean by that, it was pitched at a very high level. The system was ungodly in the eyes of the populists. Read some of those quotes. There's one from North Carolina populist insurgent, which is ungodly. It was unmanly. Now, unmanly is a very interesting notion. On the one hand, what the populists are fearing is the wiping out, their existential end. They will, at the hands of banks, railroads, commodity speculators. They are going. The small farmer, the household economy, the petty producer is being driven into extinction. That's not just a business, that's a way of life. It's like a species is dying, and it knows it's dying unless it can correct the drift of events. Now, this is not John Smith's world exactly of the self-reliant, largely immune to the market. These people are utterly implicated in the market. In fact, they are victims of the market, not just of debt, as Ambrose Bierce suggests they are, and they become the debt is the new slave driver. But they are in the market, but they're victimized by the market, and it's a world market. They're agricultural world trade, stuff is coming in from Russia, all over Europe, Argentina. They have to compete against that. There are periodic, and then of course there's all the natural disasters. The railroads are charging indiscriminatory rates to move their goods to the markets. They're dying. They're dying. Unmanly. Why unmanly? because that vision of emancipated labor, which is tied to property, that petty property. Remember, some of you were here last week. The notion that this is a way out of the customary servitude that working people have always had to endure for time immemorial, because there is land available, there is an opportunity. It's real. It really is. Not to the extent American mythology would suggest, but it's real. And now it's being extinguished, but it's a male world, because that emancipation assumes patriarchy. It assumes female subordination to that form of petty production. And so what they're wounded. There are plenty of women who are fervent populists, some very famous. Anyway, but the point is, we need to keep in mind that they're trying to hold on to this form of life. And the form of life that's opposing them, they see as depraved, as licentious. They use these languages, as sexually abandoned, right? As prostituted. These are very serious charges. You can't, it's an indictment that goes way down beneath the mere, shouldn't say mere, economic trials and tribulations they're facing. And unmanliness is part of that. And why unmanliness? Because if you're driven to extinction and you have to become a proletarian, you're a dependent, you're subordinate. You no longer can exercise that kind of self-empowerment, that self-reliance, that independence. It's scary, it's terrifying, it's enslavement, and it's why for many decades, wage labor was commonly by many people, not just people like us, socialists, by all kinds of people as wage slavery. And because, I'm getting way far. Okay, so I'm going to say, but yeah, let's stop there and ask questions. Yes.
Come back to more labor. In the reading, it seemed like the immigrant working class was the most militant, and probably the group that would bring over a lot of the socialist Marxist ideas from Europe.
Yeah.
How did those ideas from Europe kind of mix in what was happening in the US to form a special or specifically American?
Right. So that's a complicated question. Good question. Some of the most militant and radical-minded working class leaders are not immigrants. In fact, some of them come from the creme de la creme of the working class. They're craft workers whose crafts are being eroded. They're finding themselves in now industrial settings in which they still have a certain amount of power because their skills are very advanced. So they have leverage on the shop floor, but they're threatened. And they exercise that leverage against that threat of being further de-skilled and further proletarian. Others are immigrants. The immigrants is an interesting question. Immigrants, and we'll talk more about this 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about socialism. It's a mixed picture. Some are socialists, come here as socialists. There are all kinds of Jewish and Italian immigrants who come here as already radical, and they introduce that into the labor movement. There are others they're just peasants. They're very conservative. They're good Catholics. They are often resist unionization, but they are subject to periodic explosions of anger, like you might call some of the strikes that happened among immigrant populations in the late 19th century industrial jacqueries, uprisings that emerge almost out of nowhere because they've had enough. And they can be violent, they can be temporarily successful and die away. The history I wrote about the garment industry years ago. And there are endless periodic explosions of unionization efforts, often by socialists and other radicals in the government industry, that produce no results. The boss may settle and then violates everything he's agreed to, and the organization, which hardly existed at all except for that moment, dissipates. The mass strike, which is so critical to this period, is a more enduring, powerful form of that. And part of the reason, Doug, I think that people are in elite circles are worried, because the mass strike, I guess we can temporarily provisionally give 3 cheers to the Teamsters. It looks like they did good. Thanks to them, obviously, but I think all the building, well, that's a conventional situation. We're used to that. I mean, not for too many victims, but we're used to what they did, what they were trying to do, and apparently succeeded. The mass strike is different. When the 1877 railroad strike, or for that matter, the Homestead strike in 1892, or the Pullman strike in 1894, or hundreds of smaller strikes broke out, they elicited the sympathy of a whole world, which you might describe as kind of a populist world writ large. It didn't like, it hated capitalism. This new thing, capitalism, was new and offensive and fraudulent and fictitious and depraved, and so all even local militia sent to crush these strikes would refuse to fire on the strikers. State militia would refuse. 100 times the federal government had to send in federal troops because they weren't locals. They didn't know, these were not their neighbors they were being asked to shoot down. Farmers would come in from the countryside to supply the strikers with what they needed. These are very violent affairs. During the 1877 railroad strike, locomotives are burned to the ground. Tracks are ripped up. The level of violence is interesting because it alerts us to how tense the situation was. That it was a kind of sense of Armageddon. That things have come to this pass that we have to resort. And of course, violence always begins from above. It's always, not always, nothing is always, but almost all the time is initiated from above. All of these railroad companies, Carnegie Steel, they all have their own private armies. They can call on public militias, state militias, and so on, and they initiate this violence. But the difference is, whatever you may think about violence and non-violence, back then, remember I said to you last week, there's 2 things say about the past, and one is that, quote, the past is a foreign country, people do things differently there. Many of the armories in New York City were built after the 1877 railroad strike so that during the next insurrection, which everyone assumed would happen, they would be prepared to shoot people down with Gatling guns who came down the street. And when workers paraded, say at the Henry George, you read a little bit about the Henry George campaign in 1886, where he runs for mayor and nearly wins. He didn't nearly win, and came in second, beat Teddy Roosevelt. They marched through the streets, and they marched through the streets armed because their commitment was to defend themselves violently if attacked. Now, this is a commonplace in Gilded Age, working class, urban America. Yeah, other questions, yes.
So 2 major trends in this time period were the closing of the American frontier, and the expansion abroad into geopolitics and American imperialism in the Pacific and the Caribbean and Latin America. Can you talk about the impact of these 2 trends on the political economy and the labor question?
Yeah, well, I'd like to save the imperial part for the next session, when we're talking about socialism, where it confronts more directly the imperial question. What was the other half of your word about?
The closing of the
The
question.
closing frontier. Well, there's a famous historian named Frederick Jackson Turner who wrote a thesis closing the American frontier, that it marked a kind of endpoint, and it's been heavily criticized and blah blah blah. I think it's basically right in this sense that populism, you're right, is defeated. I'm talking to you, Doug. They beat it, and 1896 is a devastating defeat. William McKinley wins the presidency. Bryan is defeated. It's the end of populism. And I think it's not so much at the frontier, the availability of open land. That's what the end of the frontier is supposed to mark. The frontier is that line beyond which there is no settlement. And now that has been exhausted. Then every place is settled to some degree. And that's what Turner was remarking on, and sort of had enormous consequences for the future of democracy in the country, and so on. And I won't get into that. But I think it's right insofar as when we get to the 18th, you will never again have as a major form of, in the countryside, political economy, what is sometimes called petty or household production. As a major form, it will always, there are small farmers today, obviously. And so populism, when it dies, puts a period. The labor question up until then had been a complicated thing. It's been about slavery, it's the Civil War resolve. It's been about the sustaining of petty producers, labor emancipation through property, the wedding of labor and property, and then it's about wage labor, the new kind of free labor, wage labor, which people see in this period as wage slavery. All those things coexist in the Gilded Age, and they take different trajectories and sometimes collaborate, sometimes coalesce, and sometimes do not. Anyway, that's my view of Turner's thesis. Do you want to come back?
Come back.
Say something.
Yeah.
Okay.
What is the relationship like between the late 19th century emerging labor movement and the Populist Party, populist generation?
Right. Yeah. Good. That's what I was going to ask. What do you think? You've read a
Can you
bit.
restate the question?
The question, what he's saying, I think, is that what is the, after I've been talking about people who are not, for the main, workers. They're farmers, they're small businessmen, they join, if not the Populist Party, the anti-monopoly movement. Who thinks about the anti-monopoly movement today? It's a joke. I mean, no, it's a serious thing we've been talking about, it's a policy. Then it was a mass movement, which is telling you that it exercised the imagination and commitment of hundreds of thousands of people who felt that petty property, they not on the land but in the cities, was dying away. And that's where Henry Demarest Lloyd, well, he's the author of a very famous book, Wealth Against Commonwealth. And that quote that he writes, not about the slave power, but about liberty produces wealth, and that wealth destroys liberty. What he's saying is that in that world of petty production, the freedom to compete and engage and own property produces a lot of wealth. It does. There's a tremendous amount of wealth, but in the end, that wealth gravitates, gets concentrated and aggregated, and then destroys the ability of people to actually their freedom to engage in wealth production themselves, wealth accumulation. Hence, it destroys liberty. Hence, the anti-monopoly movement to try and stop that. How did I get so distracted? Where'd you get?
The relationship between the Populist Party and
so these are all
emergent organizations.
what's got to do with what is the labor question as it emerges in Pullman strike, Homestead strike, the 1877 railroad strike, miners' strikes at the end of the 19th century, all, these are huge upheavals. What's it all got to do with this world of? Tell me, did you read the Knights of Labor Preamble? So think about that. What is it saying in that? Like, is it addressing simultaneously both this world of the populists and this new world of wage labor? How so? Take a look at it. Or how can we do that? Okay, you can. First of all, its class is in its mind, in its rhetoric. It talks about a building up a whole class unity. It's an extraordinary organization, the Knights of Labor. Extraordinary. It respects no lines of race, ethnicity, religion, skill, all the things that we think defeat working class solidarity. The Knights of Labor is dedicated to transcending. It may not do that all the time. We read that interesting memoir by George McNeil, who was one of the heads of the Knights, talking about the race question within the Knights. But even there, you can see the social question we stay away from. But as an industrial matter, we're a united class. So it feels like a work, but it's also talking, that same preamble, about ending the monopoly on land, stopping land speculators. So it's straddling both worlds. It wants to establish not a socialist workers' republic, does it? But it talks about a cooperative commonwealth. That's different than what we think of when we think of a kind of a socialist. We think of co-ops, but we don't think of them as well, it could be part of a socialist movement, but they're thinking of a whole new, it's an alternate society. Look, they're about to go dark, but they have an alternative. We have an alternative. They have an alternative. Their alternative is born out of their lives as petty producers, but hating the competitive, self-destructive, selfish nature of a capitalist society. So they talk about a cooperative commonwealth. So what is that? Is that what is the relationship of that to the labor question?
Secure to the toils a proper share of the wealth that they create.
Yeah, right. A proper share, which is familiar language to us today. But is it what? Yes.
Seemed to me that what they wanted, their idea of the cooperative commonwealth was to restore what was being lost, and so they wanted perhaps an idealized version of a petty producers society.
In some ways,
petty bourgeois democracy.
But how does that square with other things that both the Populists and the Knights of Labor advocate? What else do they have? Nationalization of railroads, right? Yeah. Now you could say, well, that facilitates the sustaining, but still, it's a big jump. That's a violation of private property. And it's not private property. It's been sanctified since the Thermidor of the Constitution. It's sacred. You don't mess with it. Nationalizing private property, except for slaves, the biggest expropriation of private property in the history of ever. Uncompensated. That's what emancipation is. But we just finished this thought. But nationalization of transportation, utilities, and so on. What else?
I'm really struck by the item 12, secure for both sexes equal pay for equal work. I was like, whoa, that's way before I would have thought that.
So
language was
right. So they can talk a manly language and yet also move past it in some respects. Populists are very, but they're in this in-between zone. They talk about the 8-hour day. What's the 8-hour day? Why? What? It seems so pedestrian, so ordinary. Why is it not? Or maybe it is. If you say to me, so let's have an 8-hour day, so, yeah, great, that'll be good. We used to have it, which we did. We don't have it anymore. We should get it back. It doesn't seem revolutionary, does it? No. I mean, it's good, yes.
Well, it's insisting that the capitalists should not be the ones who determine the terms of their employment. And that's also tied into the language there about having the right to sunshine or whatever that section was. I mean, it's sort of like, we have a right to beauty of.
8 hours
the
for
earth.
what we
Yeah.
will, yes, exactly, right. And I think is this Trotsky, the transitional program, is that a Trotsky? I can't remember. I've been to all those sites, but I don't remember. Anyway, the point is, before there was Trotsky, there was the demand for the 8-hour day. And the transitional, I'm just joking, I don't know. The point is, the 8-hour day was a demand then, which was two-sided. It was what working people had decided was essential for them to be able to live well, and two, impossible for the capitalist class to grant. And that's why something pedestrian can move past the pedestrian, because the system won't allow it. The system can't sustain it, and it doesn't. There's no 8-hour day. There's a huge movement all over the country, strikes all over the country. The Haymarket Massacre is tied, it was a result of a strike at the McCormick Legal Works in Chicago, but that itself was tied to the 8-hour movement. The Henry George campaign, which is a kind of, George was very conservative in many ways, but it's a labor campaign. 8 hours was at the core of the demand there to take over the government. You have in these railroad strikes, in other words, it's hard to capture in a bottle what's going on. There's no one dimension to what's happened. During the 1877 railroad strike, there were general strikes, which we're a little more familiar with, and it's seen them, but we talk about them, in St. Louis and elsewhere. Why is that important? Because what's happening in the movement is a sense that we could take over, not bargain. In the Knights of Labor Preamble, there's a phrase, I don't remember it, which says, it doesn't say this, but it says in effect, dignity. That this is a system of humiliation, of indignity, working people, and this is the paradox that American society is caught up in. It has, right from John Smith's day, every man is own man, that guy, Vivacour, the farmer, labor is ennobling, labor is the way you create yourself, your independence. So there's been this tendency in American culture to ennoble and praise labor. But what's happening in the Gilded Age is it's being the opposite is happening. Labor is returning to what it always had been before John Smith showed up and said, get your own property. It's dehumanizing, worse than it ever was. It's brutalizing. And the Knights of Labor is saying enough of that. That it's not just about we want a lot of specific things. We want an 8-hour day. We want no convict labor, right? Come out of here, convict labor. Convict labor is a big deal, very big deal. It's in one way, to the degree the South industrializes it all, to some degree it depends on convict labor. That's especially black labor. Convict labor has a long history in America, white and black. Most convict laborers before the Civil War were white, and they are treated as you might suspect. So they want to get rid of that. Child labor, which we now are witnessing a resurgence of right now. Back 100 whatever years ago, they wanted to abolish. Took a long time for that to happen. So they're into very improving the conditions of labor in the way that the Teamsters want to do. And also something beyond that, and also something different than socialists would have imagined. So to appreciate what's happening in the Gilded Age, we need to be loose enough to embrace. Look, workers often did not back the Populist Party electorally, urban city workers. Why? Yeah.
The machines and more immediate things to offer them.
The machines had more immediate things to offer. And also, the Populists were for, in order to solve their debt problem, that problem that Ambrose Bierce is talking about, they wanted cheap money. cheap money isn't gonna help workers. It's just gonna inflate prices, which is exactly what the farmers wanted, to inflate prices for their stuff, but it's not. Also, they want, the populists are dependent, and farmers are on manufactured goods coming to them from the East or from Europe. They don't want tariffs, but workers want tariffs, some of them, because it will protect the industries they're working in. The infant steel and machine tool, various other industries, which are trying to compete with Britain and Germany, they want them. So there are attempts to align. Those attempts sometimes succeed and sometimes don't. It's a very fluid situation. Other comments I want to make about it. Anybody have a question? Yes.
Again, is cheap money kind of like the fact that workers are being paid like unfairly, like way more than they should be, and then it just makes the like prices just go up? Is that what you mean?
No, workers are being paid, unless they're skilled workers, they're being paid poorly. But what they fear is that cheap money will raise the prices of all goods and make it harder for them with their wages to buy what they need to buy. But it'll be inflation. It's inflation. Prices will go up. We're used to that. And a lot of workers then are fearful of that for just plain old practical reasons. The level, here's the thing. Always keep in mind throughout this course, there are two things. You can be paid pretty good while the intensity of exploitation increases. What I mean by that is that, and we'll see this again as the course goes on, and the left has sometimes, that was, if you are, let me be very, if you're a trade union, and no, get that. With the introduction of machinery, more and more sophisticated technology, the value produced in a factory, the value that the worker operating this machinery is producing, increases and increases and increases. Capital accumulation is increasing. And great. That worker, they get paid more, especially if he's skilled or has a union. It may improve his level of compensation, but his level of exploitation has gotten worse. And there was a time, let me ask you this. If we think about this connection between populism, anti-capitalist persuasion that grips parts of the country and the labor question. If I asked you in that period, what is the relationship between equality and exploitation? How would you answer? To the Knights of Labor, what is that? Today, look, I'll put it this way. Today, it's very rare, it has been for a long time, decades, to talk about exploitation. When the word is used, it's in egregious cases. Someone's getting really, really screwed. I mean, it's like, child laborers, or someone in Nicaragua is getting paid nothing to sew garments. That's we call that exploitation. Yeah, right. Maquiladoros, right? That's exploitation. Otherwise, we don't use that. But in the Knights of Labor Day, and the next time, and beyond that, exploitation is often what people are talking about. Today, what we talk about is much more, and have for some time, is equality. What do we make of that? What do you make of it? We're going to talk a lot more about this as this class continues, but why then is exploitation uppermost, and what's the relationship between the two?
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
So in Marxist terminology, exploitation has a very precise meaning about surplus value being taken from a laborer. But is that Is that what people conceived of as exploitation back then, or is this something
Well, what do you
different?
think, or what do other people think? That's a good question, but yeah.
Wasn't that in the preamble? Didn't the preamble say that the taking of the surplus from the worker? I mean, they're describing exploitation. But
yeah.
they call that out as a
Yeah.
negative
Yeah.
thing. It's not just that workers are being treated badly, it's that they're.
Or even
having
unequal,
problems.
or even the
Right.
thing which they don't like, but also that they're being exploited because they're not, yes.
Well, I guess I think maybe, and this is kind of a question I had about the violence and intensity.
Yeah,
And maybe it's because you're coming from smaller production, so like when you're coming from a small farm or a small unit, it's like you literally get all the surplus yourself. And then when that's suddenly juxtaposed against a new kind of society where it's like you kind of know how you kind of go from like these face-to-face kind of like small units to like a more alienating,
yeah.
and that might be thrown in a sharp
Yes,
sleeve.
just-
So my idea, my question when I was reading it is like, actually for everybody, it's just, is this such a strikingly violent period where the class war really just feels like a war? And then obviously juxtaposed with the now is nothing like that. And then there is this element in the reading that is very much like that background of like this immediate experience of like another way of life.
Yes,
Is such an intense part of, I think, what makes it seem so stark to people. And I was just wondering if that's part of what people read this, is part of what makes this era so stark and.
yeah. Comments, yes,
That's your question about how our language changed. But people these days, people talk about production. Production is very much formalist, and that's what exploitation originates in production. These days, people don't really much about production. They seem to think that people have bullshit jobs. There's a lot of interest in parity and debt, but like that kind of exploitation or even labor, like day-to-day work, has really receded in public discourse a lot.
I think that's true. We're gonna spend a whole class session discussing this evolution. But I think that's exactly, right. I'm sorry, I can't see, just call.
Gaia.
Okay, yeah.
Just, I mean, in response to the question, it feels like exploitation has been normalized.
Yeah, yeah.
The crux of it.
This is the thing. This is a great word. Let me just stop. I'll get to down there later. Do you think you're exactly right? We take exploitation. Nobody likes the word, so if someone says you're being exploited, they don't say it. But then people got upset by the idea of being a wage laborer. They thought of it as a new form of slave dependency. Is that possible today? We so take for granted, normalize, we so take for granted that that is the fate, that is the way the world is. Even socialists assume that. They don't rhetorically, but do they? In other words, can you imagine the passion, the advent of this new form of labor generated 100-odd years ago, happening today? Could you imagine people say, oh, this? I'm not, yeah.
I was gonna say, like, yes, I do think it's possible, and to add to everyone's point, I was thinking maybe the aspect of newness, like I think as technologies of exploitation arrive, it becomes like a real shock to people. I think we're seeing that with the SAG-AFTRA strikes, that people are seeing what AI is doing to, for instance, there is this move to have small parts be replaced by like 1 day of work, and then the companies would own that for eternity. And I think like that shock, I think, can drive class consciousness. Yeah. I think this is what happened in the 19th century. Like in our previous class, we went over the mill girls of what was the town in Mass? I forgot the name of it. Lawrence. Yeah, but they developed. They understood immediately that they were not getting the full surplus value of what they were creating. So I think that as capitalism creates these new things, I think there is an opening there, and I would hope so. I'm still why I'm in DSA, because if I didn't think that, I wouldn't be here.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's right. The newness of the experience helps to create the outrage, and the latest expression maybe not with revolutionary import, is I wrote a little article about this, is academia, where suddenly that world has become proletarianized. And people suddenly are joining unions and, talking about solidarity. This is not something you normally hear on campuses. Why? You have leftists on campus talk like that. We're talking about lots of people, and it's because that experience of being proletarianized on campus as whatever adjuncts, whatever it is, and then or facing a future that is clearly a precarious proletarian future, not the one you went to college expecting to get, creates a kind of awakening and a kind of anger that is foreign to those precincts up until the last, whatever, 5 years, whatever it is. Yes.
Seems like maybe like I suppose like part of the clarity of like exploitation versus like inequality. That it's not just like the newness, but also like the simplicity, like so to speak, relative to like the complexity of production today. So like where you might have like, say like you're working in like some kind of like manufacturing facility or something like that, like you're a skilled worker, like most of the labor that's in these places is skilled, and like so like the product that's being produced is being produced almost entirely by like a single person or a very small group of people, where you can see that for lack of a better term, like the robbery of the surplus or like the exploitation,
right?
Relative, like versus like the production, where like by the 20th century through mass production and other things, like division of labor, like every job task is so deeply divided that it's like more unclear, like less or perhaps more abstract, like the level of surplus that's being produced in some way.
Yeah, okay. Although we will see great uprisings precisely in those settings, but that's the point. Jerry.
Yeah, I mean, that seems really right. I do want to just like, I would just say, talk of inequality is still pretty recent in a sense. Like, there was a period where like we weren't talking much about inequality. So I also think we shouldn't underrate how important it is that that's like at the top of concern. Pre-Occupy or whatever, it just wasn't the top of people's minds. And I do think to go on that, I think about like what are some of the biggest growing industries and like, a lot of like Rust Belt towns, et cetera. It's like, say, the healthcare system. And it's a lot less like clear in certain ways, like, why it is. It's sort of if you're talking about industrial labor, it's like, okay, it's pretty clear that there's like a person who gets rich, there's all this stuff being made, and then there's some person or some group of persons at the top who are like pocketing all the money from the stuff being made and keeping it away from the workers. How like in a hospital system, like some people are getting very rich. It's very clear that some people are working really hard and some people are getting very rich. And so the sense of like inequality, there's something deeply wrong with the system is very clear. The sense that like where the hell the richness of the people at the top of that system, like how they're getting rich off of like people being sick somehow, like it is a lot less like clear and apparent than with like, I think, the age of industrial labor.
I think betting that is also the globalization of production, so that a lot of that experience is not, plenty is, but a lot is not happening here. It's happening abroad. There are industrial workers in the world ever have been at any time in history happens. A lot of them. So I wanted to mention just two things I feel like I should. One thing that made it a lot easier for those people is no, I'm just joking, but here's the thing. This is the thing, it's a foreign country. So they think of, thinking that the language, part of the way they envision their enemy is as aristocrats. Now, we use the word as a kind of epithet. We know the word, but we don't mean it. They meant it in this sense, that they were heirs to a different culture and political tradition than we are. That is to say, the revolution, that revolutionary cultural tradition carried on. They read Jefferson, and they read Tom Paine, and they read all this stuff about monarchy and aristocracy. They see new monarchs, the money powers, and new and they mean it because it's a threat to democracy, to the revolutionary heritage. And that helps to empower ideologically and culturally, politically, their determination. They see that. They feel that, and they're right in some sense to see that. Then about this equality thing, this is a historical thing. We're going to talk about equality later on. What's the one thing that I did not mention really in describing the Gilded Age, that framework? Race. I didn't talk about race. And why? Part of it is because American culture is, under most good, normal, comfortable circumstances, blind to that issue. It has a studied kind of blindness. It's also because the South was a land apart. It was not part of this capital accumulating or its success in reversing and overthrowing Reconstruction ended a brief period during which, and this is interesting, petty production might have flourished in the South. That's what 40 acres and a mule is a promise of. That's exactly what's being promised. That life, that kind of emancipation is being promised to the emancipated, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because of the concerted efforts of Southerners to, as the Southern elites or plantation interest, mercantile interest, to restore their political power. It also, however, happens because this will shock you. Some of them, and this is an important thing for us to understand about American history, maybe no longer. Some of the most militant abolitionists who had risked their lives before the Civil War to end slavery become adamant defenders of free wage labor. And they want the South to now develop, industrialize, need a labor force. And they will, it's not all of them, some are committed to 40 acres and a mule and fight for that. But a lot of abolitionists, quite radical abolitionists, why is that? Because that's freedom. It's not because they're self-interested capitalists, it's because the culture has defined, it lived in slavery, right? So when you're done with, when you've emancipated your slaves, you're now all free to engage in equal contractual relations with employers. You enter the market as a co-equal with your future employer. You bargain and you strike an agreeable deal. And much of jurisprudence, all from the 19th century and to this day, will be based on that conceit, right? That every piece of regulatory legislation that is passed by states in the 19th century is undone by the Supreme Court on the grounds that it's interfering with that kind of contractual freedom. That's a powerful, powerful heritage, so powerful they could even influence people who would risk their lives to free slaves, but now think, well, this is it. This is freedom. And the revelation, I'll get you to see it. The revelation for the Populists and the Knights of Labor is no, it isn't. No, it is not. There were workers back in antebellum America, I alluded to this briefly 2 weeks ago, who also sensed that. The women who worked at Lawrence and other workers and working with parties, they sensed that. Okay.
Well, and this is what the Alex Gourevitch Jackman article is about, right? It's about the group of workers who immediately after emancipation see freedom as involving the abolition of wage labor, and they want to take it further than just emancipating themselves from slavery.
Right. What I'm emphasizing is we must respect the power, the momentum of a society that has struggled for a long time for various different reasons to abolish what it understood slavery was. And it did it. That's an enormous triumph. And it creates a kind of momentum and belief that we're all free now. And right, they don't, but many do, and I mean just elites. They're committed to this idea, and that's, look, to this day, it's the American dream. I mean, that's what it is.
But this is also what is going on in your chapter of the book, right? Is that about the mass strikes? That's also that's an expression of that momentum coming out of the end of slavery.
That's right. Yes, exactly right. That's right. And the shock and the sense of being insulted profoundly. That was what was supposed to be freedom has turned out to be a new slavery. And that's hard for us to advocate. This is so powerful that we just
I just wanted to say it because I guess going back to the other thing about how they maintain their rule. I thought the other reading you gave about the Knights of Labor conference where they controversy about trying to having the governor introduced
Virginia got right.
Black knight.
Yeah.
So it gives a good sense because I think race is a real part of the story of how how
it is.
this why American capitalism is so robust.
It is, and race, though. Racism, but racism is more ecumenical than we might imagine. If some of the reading, you see, labor had always been despised in human history, and people who labored belonged to a different race of people. And when these newspapers and preachers and politicians and businessmen call these striking workers mongrel firebugs or Slavic wolves, they think of them as a race apart, inferior. When they grow alarmed that the Paris Commune is that's what Tompkins Square is. It's the that you read about Tompkins Square, right? Well, right here. That's what it was. This kind of inferior, brutalized race. And this can take, so the racial category covers a big expanse of insolent labor, insolent, insurgent, stupid, inferior working people. And the Knights, when they say we want to restore that sense of labor as its dignity, its worth, its value, are also responding to that. And this situation is so fraught that it gives rise to all kinds of utopian and dystopian expectations. The last 10 or 15 years of the 19th century America has the largest outpouring of utopian and dystopian literature that it ever had until maybe now in the movies and stuff. But
what years?
I'd say, well, I'll tell you exactly. Looking Backward, which you've all probably heard of by Edward Bellamy, is published in 1888. Caesar's Column. These are the two best-selling books, fiction books in America, next to Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 19th century. That's how big they are. Edward Bellamy is forecasting this very benign future of a kind of communal, highly industrialized, technologically sophisticated, state-run society. Caesar's Column is the drear opposite of that, a kind of society that is self-destructive, in which everybody is brutalized. Not only is the ruling class violent beyond belief and depraved beyond belief, it has so brutalized the proletariat that the proletariat is equally brutal, inhuman. And there's a raft. Those are the famous books. All through the 18th. Say again?
Who's Caesar's Column? Who's the author?
Ignatius Spinelli is a Minnesota congressman. And then he is the writer of the Populist Party platform in 1892.
What's the what party?
The Populist Party, the People's Party platform in 1892. He wrote. He was a writer, a journalist, a congressman, and right. And he writes this novel, and it's a huge success. And of course, Bellamy's novel gives rise to a whole movement of its own, the Nationalist Club. he thinks the nation, a kind of bound together, socially collaborative nation, will be the solution to this otherwise barbaric, competitive, profoundly unequal society. So, but there are others. There are real life utopias and dystopias. You know, the Pullman strike happens in the town of Pullman in 1894. That is Pullman's utopian attempt to build the perfect, paternal, working class community. He owns everything in it, the houses, the transportation, they all work for him. He built parks, recreational centers, schools, churches. It's a self-contained community.
Company script?
Say again?
Is it company script they use?
They probably use, I don't remember company script. Of course, it's one of the things the Knights want to get rid of is company
Right.
script. I don't remember if Pullman did, probably did. Almost certainly did because there were company stores and all of, so I'm going to say provisionally yes.
It's also still around today, preserved as a national historic monument, in South Chicago.
Yeah, it's a
It's
model.
like very South Chicago, but if you're going to convention, you could go
Yeah.
there. It's a little bit away.
And this is a model of how to solve the labor question. Pullman is interested in the labor question from his point of view. This is a solution to that. And there will be other kind of solutions emerging from the upper classes, from the industrial and business community. And then, of course, there's the strike. Federal troops and the injunctions. And the strike is broken. Debs goes to jail. And so that dream dies. But you know what Debs does after he had faggot head of the American Railway Union conducted the strike? He doesn't immediately become a socialist. He joins a cooperative community. See, he's part of that world. He comes out of that world. And so that the idea, well, we need to found new cooperative societies that'll be an alternative to this dog eat dog, this Hobbesian nightmare that we're all living through. So it's a world sort of betwixt and between. It's becoming a world we find familiar in some ways and unfamiliar to us, foreign to us in other ways, foreign to the way we live now, and the assumptions we make. Other
There was something about the cheap money regarding the Populists. They also were advocates of free silver, expanding the money supply, so it wasn't just based on gold. And I think their major gripe was that the money was concentrated in terms of banking loans in the Northeast where it was industrializing. And when they wanted to get some of that to them, it just wasn't to be had. It was just underdeveloped.
Yes, and there had been a long fight all through the period from the Civil War on about that question. There were proposals to both to buy metal, to coin both gold and silver. There were whole parties formed, Paul, and this is this odd connection to the labor question and this populist question called the greenback labor parties, right? Where they're kind of addressing the labor question the way the populists understood it, but wanting to make connections to these new working class movements that are emerging in the cities. So, these are, right. And so that, I don't know if I'm leaving you, but I want to make this point. The populists are not Jefferson. That is to say, it's not purely a kind of return to some Jeffersonian petty production world. They are very modern in many ways. One of the things they want to do, which they're way in advance of what becomes progressive and later New Deal policy. They advocate a government, basically agricultural price support, they have a name for it, where the government will store crops and release them when market prices have risen so that farmers can survive. They do things like that. In other words, they're they're not a throwback. Some historians have argued that all they were was an attempt to restore a dying world. It's much more complicated than that. Or some historians have argued that, they're just people with a ton of resentments, full of anti-Semitic and other kinds of phobias. And there's certainly a strain of anti-Semitism in some populist literature. It's not what motivated the movement. So I want to make a point. Yes.
Yeah, maybe we can take one last question.
Yeah, one last outside. I lost track of what time is it?
It's 8:30.
Okay. Well, any questions? So let me just say one thing, because I just want to tell you what the readings are. Please do reading for next week. But this one, I forgot a lot of that. So 2 weeks from now, yeah, it's an essay by me on 1919, one of the great all-time years for the labor movement around the world. Then there's some speeches by Debs, some speeches by and writings, not speeches by Emma Goldman, a speech by Big Bill Haywood of the IWW, and there's a documentary that's pretty good, a little boring, I felt, but not bad, by PBS on Debs. So watch that. Okay, thank you very much.
Just really quick, I think we have some announcements. Right, so you can also, if you look at your sheet on the back page, we've made it very convenient. You have the little QR codes for everything. First of all, you can join some events from our Union Power campaign. We have tickets for SAG and AFTRA and WGA that you can join and do shifts for. That's the first little QR code here. We also have a Strike Power Town Hall on the 31st at the Brooklyn Masonic Temple in Fort Greene. And then also coming up, next slide, I think. Okay, also coming up, if you look on the sheet, we have branch meetings. So is this anybody's like first time at a DSA meeting? Oh, welcome, welcome, welcome. So if you live in either South Brooklyn, Central Brooklyn, or North Brooklyn, we're having branch meetings for all of those branches this week. So you can check those out at the bottom. And then finally, here on Friday, same place, same time, half hour earlier, 6:30. We're gonna have a very special guest. We're gonna have this film, this documentary, award-winning documentary, Cuba and Africa. We're actually going to have the director there for Q&A. So yeah, if you'd like to come, that is the last QR code on the sheet. That's it. Any other announcements, anything?
If I could just boost again, do come out to and bring people to the town hall, the labor town hall. I think it'll be a good chance to discuss something actually we didn't talk too much about tonight, but the possibility that there's a kind of agreement with the Teamsters and like what that means, what comes next. Also like all the strike activity going on. So come to that and bring neighbors and friends to talk about the future of the labor movement.
What date is that?
This Monday, 7:31.
7 to 9.
Oh, I mean July 31st, 7 to 9 at the Brooklyn Masonic Temple. And sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's good.
But you were gonna.
And we were gonna pass the hat maybe, as you see, we could use like a new speaker or something. I know we got a lot of complaints.
The bicycle helmet,
This office costs money, staff time costs money, to build infrastructure and to build institutions that can do radical things, we need to commit. So please contribute either in the hat or to our Polyet treasurer, Carrington Morris. Her Venmo, she can give you, or I can give you her Venmo at Carrington-Morris.
Thank you.
Tell you pass it, I'm gonna take more minutes.
That's fine.
And thanks again to Steve, and to everybody.
Yeah, you're right. This is really, really good. Thank you very much.
Grab a notebook for next session, too. These are really beautiful. Thank you.
Yay, that's good. I got the photo, here's the clap.